I'm David Bernkoff. You are
Rebecca Polsha.
And we are your hosts of Alaska's Political Pipeline. And we have a special guest who we're going to call up now, who is in Sydney, Australia, waiting to hear from us. We have a very special guest from the future joining us right now. Elisa Choy is a marketing expert out of Sydney, Australia. So she is, I think, 17 hours ahead of us. It's tomorrow already. But what we got to know each other talking about how artificial intelligence, when you use it with social media, can in many cases improve on polling or even be better than polling. You want to explain that to our audience?
Thank you for having me, David and Rebecca. Yes, I am from the future, and we predict future trends and how people will behave in the future using internet data and artificial intelligence. So it includes social media and all websites and blogs. Everything that people engage with online outside a paid firewall is our market data set. And we're talking petabytes of data here, which is 10 to the power of 15 bytes of data.
And why does this give you insight that polling doesn't always give people?
The key thing around polling is that when you ask a person a question, sometimes they don't consciously or unconsciously tell you the truth about what they believe about themselves or about what they think they'll do in the future. And a key example is when you're asking very contentious questions, particularly around elections. If you've got somebody not wanting to disclose their true intentions, that's a bias that happens in a sample, and no matter what you do with a poll, you just can't get rid of that human element. And so what we do is we actually don't have to ask anybody a question. We're actually analysing people every day as they engage with the world through the internet in their natural environment, meaning they do not know they're being observed. Now, we're not doing this in a spooky way. We're doing it in a way of understanding behavioural interactions in aggregate for a market at any point in time for any issue. So that's probably the key. And the second reason, the secret sauce as to why we're accurate, is because we're actually analysing, one, the content, but two, the emotion in the content. Because through understanding the emotion, we know how people will behave. Because as human beings, we are driven by our emotions. Our emotions drive our behaviour, but it's actually strong emotions that will change our behaviour, like voting. And so when we can measure emotion in the content, particularly intensity and momentum of these emotions, i.e. sentiment, we are more accurate in predicting how people will, say, vote in elections.
And we asked you, and you were kind enough to spend some data time and some personal time looking at the election coming up here next week, particularly the Senate race and the congressional race. And you sent us some data and thinking points that were so interesting. We can't even get to all of it, but let's start with the Senate race. What is your sense of how Alaska voters, from doing the work that you have done, how they perceive the two main leading candidates in that race?
This is interesting. I came from a very cold start, knowing nothing about Alaska or much about the midterms. And so in a short period of time, through the data, the story that is appearing between Murkowski and Chewbacca is that in this particular race, it seems that personality politics is really front and centre. So rather than focusing on the issues in the content, there's been a lot of engagement around the campaign stories and the campaign games, I'd say. Particularly, it's got two of them are both Republican candidates. There's a lot of this infighting story that is fracturing the Republican story for this particular race, which is a disappointment. So with Lisa Murkowski, there's some really strong engagement in what we call timeless. And that means that she's relevant, she's part of society, she is part of, she's important. And so that's quite expected given that she is an incumbent and has been in the seat for quite some time, right? So That's quite an expected thing. But when you look at the emotional profile for Lisa, she's got a beautiful profile showing 100% positive sentiment and particularly described as love, which is really interesting for a candidate. And also, there's an element of high expectation, meaning that people are engaged in her story and they're looking and seeing and paying attention to what happens next. Now, for a political candidate, this is a really good profile to come into an election. On the other side with Shabaka, she's also what we call timeless, which means important, and however, she's got what we call a negative emotional profile towards her, described as despair and resignation. And her story is more mired around the political campaign gains that we've been seeing, particularly around Mitch McConnell and the false ads and the really fierce attacking between Shabaka and Murkowski. Just sort of that infighting is, I guess, overtaking the perception of who Shabaka is as a candidate, and it's not so much about what she stands for or what she's doing, it's just about the campaign story. So I find that in this view between these two, in this particular race, I would be tipping Murkowski to win, and I think it's consistent with all the polling that has been done. So I think this one is about politics and personality. And I would see that Murkowski is seen more as a favoured candidate over Shabaka.
When you're looking at their story that both of them kind of tell about themselves, Shabaka has more of like the Trump way, and how does that factor into this race? Because clearly, like Trump has said he's going to campaign against Murkowski.
Correct. So we will also look at Trump in general, just to test how much influence he has on the Alaskan races. And he does actually have more influence in Alaska than Biden, which is not a surprise. But the things around Trump and the Trumpian style or Trump-endorsed candidates, they appear to have this common theme of negative sentiment, showing me angry, dislike, aggressive. And I'm not really sure that's going to be helpful. I mean, I'm not particularly close to the US in elections, but certainly in Australia, when we look at this recent Australian federal election in May this year, the infighting and the pot shots between the parties was not helpful, and it actually deterred people and disengaged voters from the election. Now, unfortunately, in Australia, we all have to vote. It is compulsory. However, when you're in a situation like in the US, it's not compulsory. It risks people from, I guess, turning away and not even voting potentially. So I don't think it particularly helps because people want to stick to the issues.
That's interesting. So it can engage a smaller group of people in your favor, but it turns off a greater group, would you say?
Well, in my assessment, when we've been looking at elections, and we've done quite a few over the times, when it comes to elections, people really want to know where the candidates stand on the issues that matter to them. It's the only time that people ever get to sit around and talk about the issues important to their state or their country. And so, in general, when we're looking at elections, the politics of politics has sometimes taken over campaigns, and it has deterred people from engaging with the issues. And so when you have, and it's been helpful in creating engagement, don't get me wrong, because remember we're saying when you create emotions and intense emotions, be it positive or negative, you're trying to influence people to change their behaviour. Now, in this regard, the strategy based on sentiment would be that you make people angry, it gets them out to vote, right? So that seems successful in that objective. However, if it overtakes the campaign, then you're really not going to satisfy those voters who are looking for example, the Shabaka story. What do you stand for besides being anti-Murkowski, besides being everything Trump? Like, what do you personally stand for, and how do you relate to those voters so that they feel confident in voting for you?
Interesting.
That is fascinating. Which works better for you then? It seems like the whole profile of like, don't just be anti everything. You have to have things that resonate with voters. Is that correct?
That's correct, because I like to think that most people in general don't like conflict, don't like fighting. They want to stick with the issues that matter in their daily lives. How is my life going to change after the election? You know, what does it mean for my family, my job, my industry, my people, my state, etc.? So I think this is where Murkowski's her profile is looking nice and strong, because a lot of the content is around sort of what obviously her voting lines. Now she's, I guess, voted against party lines in the past, and that's been something that's been attacked by the Chewbacca camp, obviously. But also the fact that Patola is cross-endorsing Murkowski, I think is a very smart move, meaning that Murkowski seems to vote on principles, not just party lines. And so I think she stands as a stronger candidate in my view. And in Australia, I think we would love Lisa Murkowski because of that fact. So that's why we picked Murkowski.
Well, you mentioned one of the candidates on the congressional race. Let's move on to that, which is there are 4 people in it, but I'm sure your research shows there's really 3 main candidates there. And again, you had some really interesting results when it comes to how voters think of these candidates and which one they may think of as more able to govern and solve problems.
Yeah, this is interesting. So we have Patola, who has obviously come in with a beautiful story in that recent special election, and her story seems to continue she's riding that story still. So she's seen all 3 candidates, Patola, is it Begic? Is that how you say it?
Begic.
I don't know. Begic, apologies. Begic and Palin, they all have what we call transformational engagement, which means that they're highly relevant. They're also part of the conversation right now, but they're also moving with dynamic momentum, which is expected in an election. Now, because all 3 of them are transformational, we're also seeing that people are actively looking at this race with high interest. All 3 candidates have what we call active positive affect or emotional momentum. However, their profiles in the emotion are very different. So starting with Patola, she's got the highest expectation and also 100% positive emotions described as joy and elation. Now, similar to Murkowski, that's a very good profile for a candidate coming into an election. And Begic, he actually has negative emotions surrounding him. So whilst they have engagement, his is a negative engagement. Palin is in between. She's got what we call mixed emotions with a dominant negative sentiment towards her. And you can see what has been shaping this sentiment through the different stories that have been coming through. So I think it's interesting. Each of them have very different narratives. And based on the negativity towards the 2 Republican candidates, I'll again be turning to Patola to win the House.
Does that help or hurt? You talk about Murkowski kind of having the history with Alaska. Does that help or hurt to have a record and a kind of a pre-told story when you think of Patola?
Well, I don't know any of these people, and so for me, I'm looking at these 3 individuals purely on the data, and what it says with Patola is she actually has a story that is quite a lovely story around her family, her heritage. It's clear that what she stands for is coming through: pro-fish, pro-family, pro-choice, pro-oil. Her narrative, obviously, is off the back of winning that election, which was a surprise. She seems to be very friendly with people across different party lines, with Palin and Murkowski. It's almost like a teen girl club going on there. She's still enjoying that the sentiment of high hopes and that honeymoon period of coming into office. And her story hasn't seemed to be marred by any of the dogfighting that's been plaguing the Republican candidates. So to me, I think she's just a newbie to the block, but her story is still a very positive one, and her story is focused on her policy stances, which I think in this day and age and this time, people in Alaska would be turning to with open arms. Whereas with the Republican story, Begich and Palin, again, the negative sentiment was coming around their campaign. So with Begich, it's around profits from his father's books. Palin asked him to drop out, and he hasn't. Yes, he was endorsed by the ARP, but again, his story, there isn't much to his story except the campaign. And with Palin, obviously she's got more of a history in government for quite some time. But then there was a story around her quitting as governor, and some of her family dramas are coming through. Also, her ex-husband's parents had hosted a Begich event in their home. So all of these stories in the Republican camp, they all seem to be around the theme of the infighting, which is not helpful and again could risk disengaging voters.
All right, that was interesting.
Definitely.
From Sydney, Australia, Elisa Choy.